So, exactly how much money should you offer for your dream house? Let's say you're searching for a house, you find what you want, you see the listing price. How much should you offer? Should it be the full listing price? Should it be a little bit more? Should it be a little bit less? That's a key to negotiations, guys. Is at the very beginning, you got to start off on the right foot and you got to know what to offer. How do we know how to do that? We're going to talk about that. Hi, I'm David Dowell, real estate broker and real estate attorney. And I've been here in Central Florida helping buyers and sellers for many years now. And when I'm representing buyers, we look for a house, buyer finds that house they want, they see the listing price. Next thing he says, David, I want it. Let's make an offer. But how much should we offer? That's a really important question. What you offer at the beginning really sets the tone for the negotiation. And me as a broker and as an attorney, I want to make sure we as the buyer establishes control of the negotiations from the very beginning. So how much you're going to offer on a house makes a big difference. And there's a lot of factors that go into what you're going to offer. It's really an art more than a science. So we're just going to talk about a few factors today. We're not going to go into a lot of detail because that would be too hard. But some of the factors you want to consider, guys, are this. Number one, how badly does the buyer want this property? If they say, that's my dream home, that's it, that's what I want, don't lose it. That tells us something. We're going to have a little bit higher offer, right? And then there's other people who say, I like this house. This is the one I want to make an offer on. But you know what? If you can't get it for a decent price, let's forget about it. There's others. I'll move on. Let's try to get this one. So that tells us a lot. Because remember, anytime you make a first offer, typically it is lower. Not always, but typically it's lower. Now, a couple other factors to look at is the house itself. How is it priced? Of course, right? Is it priced properly? That's what your realtor's going to do. He or she's going to check and make sure it's priced correctly for the size, location, features, and so on. And we'll talk about how you value houses in another video. But let's just say your realtor is going to determine whether that's an appropriate price. If not, they'll probably come up with what they think is an appropriate price. The other thing you want to look at, how long has that house been on the market? If it was put on the market, listed for sale just last week, seller's not going to budge. Not much. They're going to say, it's early. Give me full price or really close to it. Otherwise, I'm patient. I'll wait. But if that house was listed 6, 7, 8 months ago, now you've got probably a motivated seller, don't you? And a motivated realtor. Now you got room for negotiation. The other thing you got to look at is what else is for sale in that neighborhood. Typically, buyers know what neighborhood they want to be in. And they're going to narrow it down to 1 or 2 neighborhoods. And by neighborhoods, it might be, I don't just mean subdivisions, communities, but larger areas. But they'll figure out where they want to be. They're going to look at other houses for sale. If there's nothing for sale in that area, they need to make sure they get this house. But number 2, the seller understands that buyer has options. If I'm in a community and there's 7 other houses for sale, I'm going to let the seller know that. I'm going to remind the seller that, look, you got a lot of competition. You're going to have to be a little bit flexible. So we're going to go a little bit lower price. The other thing you always want to look at, of course, is the market conditions. Right now, we're 2026 here in Central Florida. Real estate market in Florida, it's always pretty good. It's just been that way forever. But it's probably on a little bit of the slower end right now. Houses are still selling. Buyers are still buying. But it's a longer process. So that kind of goes back to how long houses are on the market. And even though some houses haven't been on the market long, sellers know there's that expectation that it can be. So you get all these factors to look at. Now, let's say you're looking at a house that's let's say it's listed for $500,000. And your realtor says it's probably worth about $500,000. Well, if it was a really bustling market, you had a lot of competition, um, you might want to actually offer something a little bit over asking price. You don't want to get in a bidding war because what's going to happen if it's a really, really good market for sellers, tough market for buyers, then what's going to happen is sellers going to get a lot of offers. And he or she's going to look at those offers. They're going to pick the top three or four and they're going to narrow it down. They're going to go back to those three or four buyers and say, it's a lot of competition. Come back and give me a better offer. Come back and give me your best and final offer. The price could keep going up above the listing price. In fact, that's a tactic that a lot of realtors use when they're putting together a listing price. They want to lower it enough to get multiple offers. Then once they got people in, it's like starting to reel them in. Now they want to start putting these guys against each other, a bidding war. But most likely in a market like today, we're not going to have multiple offers, probably. You might have a couple, but typically it's a slower market. When you have an offer given to a seller, it's typically the only one they have in front of them at that time. So what do you offer? Well, you want to offer less than the selling price, right? Because you want a good deal. But you also do not want to go so low that you're going to lose the seller. What I mean by that is we have in this market a lot of investors that are trying to grab these houses for as little as possible. If I list a house for $500,000, I tell you I'm going to get several phone calls or emails from people saying I'll offer 400. Now that's a ridiculous price. I don't want to sell it. My seller doesn't want to sell it for 400,000, 80% of the listing price. But you're going to get those. When most realtors get, in all due respect, what I call stupid offers, when most sellers get those, many realtors will just ignore them. Now, I tend to respond because you never know what could happen. But my response to that offer is, when somebody says they're going to offer 400, I respond saying the listing price is 500,000. If you or your client is serious, please feel free to make a reasonable offer. But what happens is typically, if I'm going to make an offer, you want to make it low enough that you're getting a good deal. But you want to make it high enough, or at least close enough to the listing price, that the seller is going to be intrigued and that they're going to, at the very least, respond with a counter offer. So in this market in Central Florida being a little sluggish, if I see a $500,000 house my buyer wants, we might, and it's not something they have to have, but they'd really like to have it. We might make an offer as low as $470,000. If it's a cash buyer, we're going to do a quick close. That always helps. But 470 is a little low, but it's high enough to get the attention of the seller. They're going to counter offer. What are they going to counter at? I don't know. Some sellers who are really sticking to their guns will say, we'll counter at 495, which is telling me that they really want something close to the $500,000 asking price. Other realtors or sellers through the realtors will come back and say, you know what? It's listed at 5. You offered 470. I want to get this deal done. We'll counter at 485. Wow. That's a big movement. Now we know we've got a seller who's willing to negotiate. That's really, really important, guys. That determines our next step. So now, without going in, through the whole process, you start going back and forth. Oh, 475. Oh, no, I'll do 482. Okay, 470. You come to a price. But the bottom line is you got to know where that initial price is. Like I said, it's got to be high enough to get the seller's attention. But it's got to be low enough to give yourself a bargain. I've had people, now I'm pretty good at negotiations. I've done this forever as a broker and as a real estate attorney. But I've had buyers come to me and say, I want to offer this really stupid low price. And I kind of look at them and I'm like, there's probably 95% chance we'll never even hear back. They're like, I know, let's do it anyway. I've had some have actually been accepted. I recently had somebody looking for a townhouse, an older unit, listed at $210,000. Now, I knew how much my buyer wanted to pay for it. I know how much they could pay for it. But they came out and said, you know what? Let's offer 180. I explained to them, it's pretty low. You might not get even a response, but you know what? Seller took it. It happens. But if you went any lower than that, we might not have gotten a response from the seller. If we did go lower, if we stayed there and we did get a response, we've probably lost the upper hand in the negotiations. We're the ones always starting to try to catch up. So the bottom line is your initial offer is really important. So what you need to do is make sure your real estate broker or agent is experienced. They understand the negotiating game. Everybody's going to say they do, right? All realtors watch these TV shows and think they're $1 million listing realtors. And some are experienced, but some are not. So you just got to make sure, and that's something you're going to have to determine when you're talking to your realtor, is he or she the kind of person who can negotiate? Can they be tough, but at the same time be understanding and have the personality to try to get through these sales negotiations? So, but always consider that first offer is really important, guys. When you're looking for a house, it's not just the listing price. Remember, you've got to get a deal done, and you want it to be to your advantage. We almost always can get the house for less than the listing price, but you got to know how to approach it. So, if you guys have any other questions about negotiations, initial offer prices, feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. You can shoot me an email, text, phone call. There's no obligation. I love talking about this stuff. So if you got any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.